Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen Biggins. Kathleen is the founder and president of Sea Change Conversations. As many of you know, Kathleen is truly a communications expert. Prior to founding Sea Change, she was a advertising and communications professional. Back in 2014, Kathleen recognized that climate change was a significant risk, but that few people were talking about it because it was seen as such a polarizing and far off topic. That year, she pulled together a team now known as Sea Change Conversations with the goal of depoliticizing the issue and helping others understand how it might impact them personally. So fast forward 10 years, and those who were in the waiting room saw the many highlights along the way. Great progress has been made. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen.
Thank you. As Molly mentioned, we were really fortunate to have this experience. Sea Change has had the dream of attending COP for many years. We have applied to be official observers, but that process takes several years. So hopefully we will hear in the next year or two whether we have been accredited. But in the interim, because of Carrie's wonderful friendship with Jay Lemery, who is a doctor who started the first Department of Climate and Health at the University of Colorado. Jay also started an organization called the Climate and Health Foundation, which is a group that trains health professionals, doctors, and other health professionals to advocate and educate about climate change and the intersection with health. This amazing group has educated people around the world, and they have come together for 3 years running to advocate and educate at COP. Jay was kind enough to invite us to go with his group, and it was a lifesaver because otherwise I think Carrie and I would still be wandering around Dubai lost like sheep. It is a very confusing situation, and being able to embed with this group was a true gift. The other group that facilitated us going is Climate Central. Climate Central has been a wonderful friend to us from our very conception, and they were kind enough to put us on their list of requests to get into the blue zone, where one needs a special pass. And that is where all the diplomacy happens and all the high-level decisions occur. And those tickets are like gold. So we were truly fortunate to have the friendship and the help from these two great institutions. So the first part of this is going to give you a sense of what it was like. And the second part is going to talk about kind of what our takeaways were about what was accomplished. I have described it as both overwhelming and intoxicating. And the reason I say them both because it was overwhelming. It was on such a scale, both physically and mentally, that it was hard really to wrap your hands around or your head around. And it was intoxicating because all of a sudden you were with 85,000 other people who were passionate about climate change and who were there to try to make a difference. And that was indeed exhilarating. So the site itself was about 1,000 acres. It was set up on the site of the World Expo in 2020. So there was a lot of very interesting architecture, as you can see there. And I don't know if I just said that, but it was on 1,000 acres. So one part was the blue zone, where the high-level negotiations went on and where we needed that blue pass, that special key to get in. And in that blue zone, they had groups that were called, or two big modern buildings where the plenaries took place. And these are the rooms that you see on the TV with the high stages and the backlighting. This is where a lot of negotiations went on, and it was difficult to get into many of these rooms. Sometimes you had to go to an overflow room and watch on video, but we were able to get into a few. And one of the ones that we got into was really exciting. It was on December 3rd, where they had their very first Climate and Health Day. And we were there with this group of professional medical that was so excited to be there and to see that health was finally elevated to a major place within the discussion of climate. We also got to see the president of COP, President Sultan Al Jaber, who welcomed the group and laid out that the 1.5 degree increase in temperature was still his North Star. And that was the goal, to keep that within reach for the entire conference. And to hear him say that is a little different than just to hear about it. And it gave us hope that indeed the powers that be were trying to really get to an agreement where we could keep that within reach. In addition, the president of the World Health Organization was there, and the two of them together really struck the note that climate, or that health, is really the face of climate, meaning that is how we experience climate change, through the deprivations, through the dangers. That is the human face of climate change. And that's why it was so important to have an entire day focused on it. And coming out of that, over 123 nations signed a declaration and also donated to a fund that would help strengthen healthcare systems around the world. There were other days as well, and a lot of other high-level speakers. Here we see John Kerry talking with the head of the International Energy Agency. And here we have a discussion about the role of and vulnerability of women and climate change. And this was moderated by Hillary Clinton, who you can see in the black at the far right. And I thought this also was very, very interesting because historically, women have not been elevated in the discussion in any way, and women are by far the most vulnerable, in part because they tend to be the poorest, and they also tend to be most dependent on natural resources and farming, which are being hurt by climate kind of on the first wave. And so this recognition that women not only are imperiled, but also have a lot of the wisdom, and also are the ones that can create the more sustainable environment and needed to be supported, was also a first for a COP. So outside of those kind of glitzy, beautiful, high-tech plenary rooms, there was also a whole rabbit warren of buildings full of tiny little conference rooms. And these were the pavilions. These pavilions were hosted by organizations like Rotary International or the World Wildlife Fund, or by countries like China, where I went to for a talk, or the US. OPEC was also there, showcasing what they have done to be more sustainable. And in all of these different pavilions, there were different speakers at different times. And so you were kind of scrambling around trying to get to where you wanted to be to hear the group that you wanted to hear on this huge campus. After 2 days, oh, and the other thing that was kind of interesting about the Blue Zone is as you were walking, again, trying to find out where to go and to get to the place you wanted to be, all of a sudden a phalanx of men in white robes would come pass you by. And embedded in the middle would be someone who was the prime minister of Japan, or an African leader in full African dress. And you weren't sure necessarily who they were, but it was kind of exhilarating just to see them walking through and realize that these were the people that were making some of the major decisions that will impact all of us going forward. After the second day, the Green Zone opened up. The Green Zone is open to the public. It had great exhibitions on the energy transition. It also had different presentations and panels as well. It was so big, you really needed to take a bus to get around. And as I said, the entire things together were huge. And then there was a third zone that you needed to take a bus or a metro to, and this was called the Innovation Hub. And this was really like a trade show, if you will, of new technologies and also new services built around the energy transition. And what my colleague here, Carrie Dykman, is holding is actually graphite. And this was from a company that takes clean energy and methane, and then through its industrial processes, comes out at the end with graphite and with clean hydrogen, both which are very valuable in manufacturing and other processes. So it was kind of fun to literally be holding something that had been taken out of a gas and turned into this black carbon. In addition to all of these official venues, there were also media hubs. And these were places where interviews were being held throughout the conference. And on our very first night, we were able to attend one that the Wall Street Journal had sponsored, where John Kerry was interviewed. And as you can see, all of these hubs were in very beautiful places. This one overlooked the marina in Dubai. And it was fascinating to see John Kerry there. He was incredibly articulate and incredibly insightful. And you realize that he had probably been interviewed 7 times already in that day, and he was still with good humor and still quite articulate. And I have to say that I was impressed with the value that he brought because he's had such a long tenure in this environment. And he knows the people that he's negotiating with so well. In addition, Bloomberg Green had a phenomenal lineup, and it also was in a hotel. But the thing that we loved about this is that you could sit there, and every 30 minutes, a whole new set of speakers would come in and give you a different perspective on climate change. And 2 of the ones that I thought were really fascinating were juxtaposed next to each other. And I'll explain why I think it was such a contrast. One was Ray Dalio, who is the chief investment officer of the world's largest hedge fund. And on the other side, you see 2 of the youth advocates for the UN, one from Brazil and one from Pakistan, who talked about their understanding of what's happening and their sadness on how slow the transition is happening. So for the capitalist on the left, he more or less said, climate change is going to be expensive. It's going to be expensive whether we act on it, or it's going to be expensive if we don't act on it. It makes sense for society to act on it, but in order to do so, we need a lot of money. And in order to get that money, we need the private sector and big institutional investors to care. And the only way that's going to happen is if indeed there's a profit motive on the other side, and that he was seeing a lot of deals beginning to happen, and that he thought we could be at a transition point where indeed the private market was going to engage on a much greater scale. So that was somewhat positive. On the other side, these 2 young women were angry. They were angry that the progress had been so slow when the knowledge of what is happening has been understood for so long, and that even though action was being taken around them at this COP, it just was lackluster. It wasn't getting us where we needed to go as quickly as we need to get there. A third hub that we attended was the Axio House. Again, it was a fascinating place. There were lots of very high-level interviews that we were able to see, including this one with Al Gore. But I thought I might note that at these events, it was also an amazing opportunity to network. You could just put out your hand and meet someone interesting. We met the CEO of a fusion company that was a spinoff from MIT up in Massachusetts that is promising to have fusion energy on the grid in the next 2 decades. Fingers crossed. We also stuck out our hand and met the senior strategist at the World Resource Institute, a very well-respected not-for-profit. I met the former head of BP Oil, Lord Brown, who's the one who started Beyond Petroleum campaign, and just so many other types of people from all different aspects of climate change. And it was fascinating. And one of the things that also I should mention, as Carrie and I both found, is that people were really intrigued by what we do, and that there were groups in America trying to bring people together in understanding and to depoliticize and defang the issue. And because we were in these environments, especially the media environments where there were a lot of business people, it was fascinating to interview them and ask them how this COP was different, what they were seeing, or what the tone was compared to past COPs. And what we heard kind of over and over was, as business people, they weren't there to observe. They were there to network, and they were there to get business, because now climate action, this energy transition, is seen as a real business opportunity. And hang on to that, because I think that was one of the major messages that I took away, that we are getting to the point where it's not about sacrifice. It's not about doing just the right thing, but it's about the fact that the new technologies and the new processes are providing the opportunity to do the right thing and also to be profitable. Just what Ray Dalio was saying was needed. In addition, there was a day of rest, which we really needed. And on that day of rest, the entire summit was closed down. And we had the opportunity to travel around Dubai with someone who had lived there for 23 years and had raised her children there. And we got an inside look at what it feels like to live in, as what she calls, a gentle autocracy. And this means that you do not complain or criticize the government. And indeed, their leaders were looking down from major posters all around the city. But for that, there was great opportunity. There was great education. Women are educated the same as men. Women are paid the same as men. There was great healthcare, and there were great cultural enrichment. And it was a very different kind of sense of the Middle East than I think many of us have as our preconceptions. And I would also say that while some people kind of lampoon Dubai as being a Las Vegas-like Tinseltown, I didn't have that impression at all. To me, and I think to my colleague Carrie, it was just brand new. It had all been built in the last 35 to 40 years. The architecture was stunning and inventive. And the whole kind of gestalt was looking forward about progress. And the other thing that kind of surprised us is that Dubai is not dependent on its oil wealth, that in fact they have diversified their economy to be quite strong in shipping and also financial services as well as tourism. And that also, I think, has enabled it to broaden its perspective and perhaps aided in its ability to be effective as the host of this COP. On our very last day, we were able to go to Abu Dhabi, which was a whole different experience. This is at their great mosque, which was an incredible edifice. And the only reason I'm sharing this with you is because it was just so eye-opening to us, and again, reinforced this sense of being about the future and not all about the past. And one of the things that we heard over and over again is that the Emirates were a beacon of light within that part of the world because they provided such economic opportunity from citizens from countries around. So again, a very, very different experience than what I had anticipated. And I think Carrie and I felt very, very fortunate to have been able to see it firsthand. And yes, I had to share. This was our breakfast the very last day in the desert on the camels to get a sense of what Dubai was like in the past, as well as understanding where it is today. So that gives you a sense of what our day-to-day was like, what the feeling was like on the ground. But let's get to the nitty-gritty, which is what was accomplished at COP28. And I think to understand that, I want to just remind everybody what a COP is. A COP is shorthand for a conference of parties. It's a committee that comes together after an international treaty has been signed that enables the countries to hammer out how it will be implemented. There are COPs for many different things, for chemical weapons, for biodiversity, but I think the ones that we've heard about the most has been around the climate. And the very first one was started all the way back in 1992 when the United Nations created the framework for the Convention on Climate Change. The most famous one, of course, was the Paris Accord in 2015. And the reason was because at that point, all of the nations of the world came together and said, hey, we are on a dangerous track. We cannot allow the temperatures to continue to ratchet up. We need to come together to find ways to stop the temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, and even to strive for that 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason that they thought we could get there was a runway at that point, and there was a sense that at those levels, the runaway damage from climate change wouldn't happen, and that we could manage the changes in nature and in the systems all around us. And this COP, the one that Carrie and I attended, was the first global stocktake, which means it was the first time that a report card was being given to all of the countries on how well they had done to what they had promised at the Paris Accord. And I have to say, depending on who you read, the grade was kind of like pretty mediocre to pretty terrible. And the fact of the matter is, even though we have recognized the risk, countries have been slow to act in a way that makes their recognition really, really credible. So again, the reason we needed that COP is because the world came together and realized that we are on a very dangerous path, that we are on a path that could make parts of the world relatively difficult or even uninhabitable for the human species. And while COVID gave us a tiny little break in emissions, now that we have come out of that, our emissions are rising. In fact, last year, the emissions were the highest ever. And sobering, last year, we had the highest average global temperature as well. It has risen as of last year up at 1.4 degrees C. Now, we had said we wanted to keep at 1.5 degrees C, so 1.4 is getting awfully close. Last year was an El Nino year. This year is expected to also have El Nino influences, might even be hotter. But then experts think we will drop down a bit, but it does show how rapidly we are coming up to what we had said we wanted to be our ceiling. And yet we are nowhere close to being able to cut off the spigot on the fossil fuel usage that is going to drive us past that. The other reason we need a COP is that this is a wickedly difficult problem because the countries of the world are very, very different and have very different needs and have a very different view on the problem. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as in a bit. And then the other reason why we need it is because emissions in China cause problems in Peoria. And what we do in America can impact others all around the world. There are no borders with climate change. We're all in this together. And every sector is contributing because our entire economy has been really built on the foundation of fossil fuels. So one of the things that did come out of this was the slimmest of hope that we really could stay to that 1.5 degree C increase, or that 2.7 degree Fahrenheit. It is possible, but it would take a type of unified effort that we haven't seen yet. And so it is considered really improbable. The next goal, of course, is to keep well below 2 degrees C, because we know that every smidgen of a degree has ramifications for our natural world and for our safety and for our economies. So every smidgen of a degree is worth fighting for. So if we hit 1.5 and go over, it doesn't mean that we can stop working. It means we just have to work harder. In order to get there, we would need to decrease our greenhouse gases by about 43% by 2030. And instead, what we're projected to do is kind of get up there and plateau. I mean, there are things that are working for us, but it's not enough to get us on that downward track yet. It's kind of just enough to keep us from going higher. What would be necessary to meet that goal? We would need to drop our usage of coal by 75%, our oil by 10, gas by 10 by 2030, and then much more significantly by 2050. And this would be an extreme challenge to our economies unless we can create the systems and get them to scale fast enough that we can continue to power our economies without putting our energy in jeopardy, but also power our economies without putting up these dangerous emissions. Now, what went right? Well, even though many activists wanted the words phase out, we didn't get it. But what we did get for the very first time is a recognition from all the nations of the world that we need to walk away from fossil fuels. We have to transition away from all fossil fuels. And this is a huge deal, something that is really unimaginable just 5 years ago. In Glasgow, in a prior COP, they did talk about moving away from coal, but that was singled out. This is the first time that there's a recognition that all fossil fuels need to be transitioned away. And so even though it's not as strong as we had hoped for, it is still something to be celebrated. There were also a sense that instead of saying we had to cut fossil fuels, there was going to be an effort to increase other forms of energy and kind of squeeze them out. So instead of a radical cut, it was more about supporting the cleaner forms so that fossil fuels naturally became a smaller piece of the pie. This includes tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency, and also tripling nuclear. The language is weak. There are very few calls for real action. The targets aren't really quantified, but we can't ignore that this is aspirational. And the fact that all of the countries came together to agree on it is really almost, I don't want to use the word miraculous, but really surprising and outstanding that it did indeed happen. And it shows that there is an evolution happening in world opinion. There is a coalescing around this understanding that we have to act. We can't quibble, we can't fight, we can't just say what's right for us. We have to collectively understand that we must act. And this movement will inform governments to take further action, make stronger pledges in what they say they will do going forward. And that's critically important. And we have already seen it. We saw it in the United States with EPA rules on methane. We've also saw it in the US with protection of old growth forests. And it's almost like the bar has been set higher, and now countries need to figure out how they can jump over it. And that is a good thing for all of us. It should also accelerate movement within the private sector, again, because it's clearly showing the rules of the road, where societies are going, and where, therefore, it would be safe to invest. So I told you that the average grade of the stocktake was probably like a C or below, and that is true. But there has been a fair amount actually accomplished in the years since the Paris Accord. And so take a minute and look at this graph with me. The purple is the line we were on at Paris, and that was going somewhere between almost 7 and 9 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. That is a crazy amount of heat for the world to acclimate to at such a quick rate. And it would have been incredibly dangerous for almost all the species that share the earth with us right now. We started to create policies that brought that rate down. And you can see our current rate is much lower, like around 4.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are binding pledges that are and policies that are in place. And there have been additional pledges that are not binding yet, including some net zero promises that would actually bring us down closer to that 2.7 degree number at the very bottom Fahrenheit, which is much closer and much safer than where we were, much closer to where we want to be and much safer than where we were at the Paris Accords. And if you think about that, that was 2015. That was 8 years ago, and we have made real progress in bending the curve. But we need all those countries to actually deliver on what they have pledged to do. And we need new processes and new innovations and new promises to get us further, to get us down to the safer spot, to safer levels. Key accomplishments. The very first day of the event, the COP groups came together and operationalized the Loss and Damage Fund. This is a fund where wealthy nations give support to poorer countries that are being ravaged by climate change to help them rebuild. It has been a huge contention point. And on the very first day, it was announced it had been resolved and that it was going to be funded. And I think by the end of the conference, it was funded by about $800 million. So not enough, but a substantial beginning. And it was very enheartening for some of the lesser developed countries, because this had been something that they had felt was just so unjust and was not being recognized by the developed world. There was also a methane agreement that was really revolutionary. For the first time, the oil companies attended. There were about 50 of the major oil companies there, representing about 40% of all production. And they promised to get kind of net zero methane leaks by 2050. Methane is a very deadly greenhouse gas. It's about 80 to 85% more potent than carbon dioxide over shorter periods of time, about like 20 years. So if we can cut that methane leaks and flaring quickly, it could actually bring our temperature down. So it's one of the most important low-hanging fruits, short-term actions that we can do to stay safer. And the fact that Darren Woods, the head of Exxon, was there, recognizing that the pressure from the world is building, that again, world opinion is shifting, and he needed to be there and there needed to have some sessions, I think was a real win. I mean, clearly there's much more we can ask of them, but it was, again, something that was almost unimaginable just 5 to 10 years ago, that they would be at the table, they would be making these concessions. In addition, there was kind of a broadening of perspective of the threat to recognize just how widespread it is and how damaging it is across the natural world. One of the things that was recognized for the first time is the ties between climate change and with biodiversity. And also how important it is to protect our ecosystems, whether it's our oceans, our mountains, and something that's been in the news so much lately, our ice scapes, our glaciers, because they're changing rapidly. And as they change, they have repercussions for our safety and for our economies. Food was a big deal this year, as it should be, because so many of our emissions come from food, but also our food is so vulnerable to these changes. And food security is one of the really clear faces of climate change as well, because we are seeing a growth in world hunger, and we're seeing our water systems and increase in drought that has direct ramifications for people being able to continue to get the calories they need. And again, the focus on health as being that personal face of climate change was something very important. And the funding of strengthening healthcare systems around the world, the recognition that that's needed, was also really important. There was a call for halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation by 2030. And outside of the natural world, which we kind of focused on right there, there was also an accelerator announced to help support and grow the technologies that can help a wide range of industries, from steel to cement to shipping and long distance flying, things like hydrogen and others. So to let there be an accelerator that would help all these different sectors benefit by investing together. What there wasn't, as we mentioned a little earlier, quantifiable targets, clear language. What there wasn't, focus on adaptation. We know that a lot of changes have been set into motion. No matter what we do, there will be forces coming that will harm us. And we need to figure out how we can live with these new norms within nature. And that really wasn't addressed very well. I will say that Ray Dalio did say that when nations began, or when nations and economies began to focus on adaptation, he thinks there will be more universal participation because everybody is at risk. It's no longer, I get my economic gain if I ignore the problem. It's we are all at risk. And so we're all going to have to start funding the solutions and the processes that will help keep us safe. So hopefully he's right, that becomes a game board that has more pieces on it and more people are engaged. Finance is also one that wasn't good enough. The presidency of COP has said that they received pledges for 83 billion across all the different funds, all the different initiatives from all the different participants. Climate change is going to take trillions a year to address. And we need more. 83 billion sounds like a lot. In fact, while we were there, it almost sounded like monopoly money, as you heard, 100 million here and 3 billion there and this and that. But in fact, when you add it up, it's still not enough to get us there. And much of it is predicated on continuing administration. So if an administration is no longer in office, a lot of their pledges may not actually come into fruition. So look in COP29 for a lot of focus on adaptation and finance. Why did this agreement finally get reached to transition away from fossil fuels? And I think it's really because of the year we lived through. 2023 was an incredible year as far as natural disasters and hardship. There were 63 $1 billion disasters around the world, which displaced thousands or tens of thousands of people. There were fires in Hawaii, but there were also fires in Greece. There were droughts in Spain, but there were also major droughts down in the Amazon, in Brazil and across the Amazon valleys. It was everywhere. And I think that citizens and countries took notice that people were beginning to actually see climate change around them. The other thing I think is really helping is that the science of attribution, of being able to link a natural calamity or a drought or a flood to climate change directly through science and say, yes, this was made more likely, or yes, this was made more ferocious because of climate change, is making it harder to deny. For example, the drought that I was mentioning down in the Amazon was made 30 times more likely because of climate change. That kind of knocks your head back, and it makes you think about, if it's 30 times this year, what will it be next time? It forces governments to take this more seriously. The other thing is that we have new technologies that enable us both to measure emissions and also to improve emissions. We have new satellites that can capture methane emissions. There are new lasers that are going to be put up over the Permian bases and other places that will be checking on a several times a day basis for leaks. And so people won't be able to say we didn't know about it. They're going to be told about it, and they're going to be held accountable to act on it. And that is new because before, methane was invisible. We couldn't measure it, but now we can. The other thing that both Carrie and I felt very strongly is that the fact that Dubai hosted was originally lambasted as how could we allow an oil-rich petrostate to host COP? But perhaps because of what Dubai is, I mean, think about where it is located. It's on the cusp of Asia and Africa. It is a country that really didn't exist in any major way until 35 years ago. And yet now it has a vibrant economy based on many different things. As I said, financial services, tourism, shipping. It bridges so many things. And it is part of the oil, I don't want to say cartel. It is part of the countries that have benefited from the use of fossil fuels and now have to walk away from them while they still are such a key part of their economies. And so they were kind of uniquely positioned to broker this discussion across all these different groups. And we think that could have helped lead to the success at the end. Also, we should recognize that the geopolitical upheaval around the Ukrainian war, it's kind of changed energy politics and our understanding of energy because it made natural gas so expensive and because there was such fear in Europe about what that would mean for their economies. It really forced Europe and other parts of the world to really double down on their decarbonization and to become less dependent on the world markets on fossil fuels, which can become so volatile. We also should note again that we had very seasoned diplomats there. The Chinese diplomat and John Kerry had known each other from 30 years. There was a great story about how John Kerry was walking through the blue zone and a car drove by. He hailed it down. It was the Chinese diplomat. He jumped in the car and they drove off to continue their discussions and negotiations. To me, that sounded like something out of Madam's Secretary, but that kind of collegiality, that kind of familiarity enabled them to broker some agreements over some very difficult things. And it was reported that it was China and the US together that helped push the language to transition to become accepted. And so it was important at this COP. Both of them have now retired, so we have lost that longevity. We will see what fresh new people and faces will do in the future. But I think that was part of the success this time. And then perhaps the most important reason why we're beginning to see this recognition of needing this transition faster and more broadly than in the past was accepted was the fact that the economics around this issue are just changing so much more quickly than most people recognize. This is a chart that shows how the levelized cost, all cost in of renewable energy has become cheaper on an average global basis than fossil fuels. And that's happened all the way back in 2018. But the thing that I find so intriguing is where it's expected to be at the end of 2030, because the more we build of these clean technologies, wind, solar, batteries, the more scale we get and the cheaper they become. And that cannot be the same said for those things that we extract from the earth. And so the differential, as you can see at the end of the decade, is really significant. And that is creating more impetus to figure out how to build more of these clean technologies in a way that will still provide stable energy systems and stable economies. And this too is, I think, really enheartening. This shows how investment in the energy transition is just skyrocketing. In fact, in 2023, it was almost $1.8 trillion. And that is versus only 1 trillion invested in fossil fuels. And so the momentum, the new energy, the new construction is moving to be in a way that in the long term is beneficial in fighting our fight against climate change. That said, it was a tough fight. I think you guys know that COP was almost a failure, that they had to extend the days, several days, in order to get an agreement. Early on, we were notified that OPEC had sent out a letter around saying there is no way we're agreeing to any cut to fossil fuels. It is reported that Saudi Arabia called a phase out of fossil fuels as economic suicide for his nation because they are so dependent on fossil fuel for their economy. At the same time, island countries were saying anything less than an immediate phase out is a death sentence for our nation. And then you had that whole cadre of countries that are not developed yet, but have rich fossil fuel resources that are looking and seeing the developed countries making lots of profit on their fossil fuel riches and even building them and growing them. And they're being told to leave it in the ground, that they cannot partake on the fossil fuel game board. And there is a sense of injustice there that is credible, that needs to be understood. And then you also have India and China specifically, whose economies are still growing. I know China is beginning to lag now, but are growing in a way that their energy needs are voracious. And they are meeting that, yes, with a lot of renewables. China is building more than half of all the renewables and investing about half of all the dollars in the world in renewables. So they are focused there, but they are also building coal. And between India and China, that's really where most of the coal is being built because they say they need it for consistent energy while they are growing their economies at such a rapid rate. And so all of those different constituencies with different needs were there and needed to come together with common purpose. Personal takeaways, it was a trip of a lifetime. It was amazing to be with people who were like-minded, as I said in the beginning. I left so hopeful. I met so many people who were involved with new technologies and new ideas that were passionate. We met a whole cadre of young people from around the world that were there to lobby leaders about what it means for their generation, and they were just so inspirational. Another takeaway was that the media bias was so visible. You would sit at some of these hubs and hear an interview and then read about it the next day, and whatever slant it was definitely slanted. And we're like, wow, I wouldn't have led with that, and I definitely wouldn't have used that headline, but I'm sure it got more clicks or it got more advertising, whatever it was. But it was interesting on the left and the right. There was definitely media bias in play. I think I talked a little bit just now about how unfair this problem is, that those who are poorest, those countries that have the least ability to protect themselves and to prepare for the future, are the ones that are feeling the brunt of climate change the worst. And they are calling the world to task because they did not get the riches of the fossil fuels. They haven't had the development that others have, and yet they're the ones who are paying the biggest price. How difficult it is to solve just because there's so many components. Just as I said, the actual physical plant of COP was almost unmanageable. This problem is like the Kraken. There are so many tentacles and so many arms and legs, and there's so many interconnections. It is hard to solve, but that doesn't give us a bye. We still need to step up to the plate and do it. And the way we're going to do it is for forging new processes, creating the new innovations, coming up with the solutions. And there's so many of them out there. And there's so many that we have in our hand that if we scaled up could get us in a much safer place. And so it's not that we don't have the answers, it's that we don't have all the answers, but that we aren't moving fast enough. And then, of course, just how surprising the Emirates was and how different it was from the old Middle East and how it was stepping forward and becoming a real powerhouse within the Middle East, kind of supplanting some of the oldsters because its economy and its promise of its future is so great. Next steps really matter. The US and other developed countries are being called upon to cut our emissions. We can't continue to use up all of the air, all of the atmosphere, all of the holding power for emissions and leave everyone else dry. We have the ability to morph off to other types of energy. It is our responsibility to begin to cut as quickly as we can. US and other wealthy countries are also called to provide money and technology to the middle and low income countries so that they can create clean energy systems. Because again, if they move into coal, if they move into oil, if they move into gas, those emissions are going to harm us. So it behooves us to help them skip over the dirty energy directly to the clean energy. We are also called upon to help them cope with the climate damages, or they will be overwhelmed. And we are called upon to protect the natural carbon sinks of the world, the Amazons, our temporal forests, our kelp forests. We have to recognize the value in the natural world in addressing this problem. There is a burgeoning understanding that stanchion of trees provides services much more than turning it into paper products. We have to value that, and we have to find ways to protect those common resources. And yes, all of these will indeed cost trillions. So was it a success? It depends on who you ask. Did we get far enough? Of course not. But again, if you think of where we were just 8 years ago, and you think of what was agreed upon and what was accomplished, you can kind of say, we may not have gotten what we wanted, but perhaps we got the best of what was possible at that moment and in that place. So hopefully you have a good idea of what we experienced and what our takeaways were, and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.